Welcome back to the Rational Nationalist. We started this week by examining Zoran Mamdani's quest to make socialism actually work, starting with his inaugural promise and continuing with his commission on government efficiency. In doing so, he has quickly emerged as the adult in the room for the Democratic Socialists of America, reaching out to Donald Trump and showing that he can act like an adult around people with whom he disagrees, instead of simply shouting and engaging in camera-ready histrionics for his partisans, presents the image of a mature statesman as opposed to the revolutionary leader role that most of the DSA has opted for. Instead of simply fighting this, protesting that, and attacking his enemies nonstop, he is actually focusing on building a positive message for the Democratic Socialists beyond fuck Trump, which has been pretty much the only thing the Democrats have stood for in the past decade. To be fair, a lot of this is more the Pelosi, Obama, Clinton institutional center wing of the party that's made an effort to cling to their own roles in power by demonizing Trump and embracing Marxist left policies. The Marxist left wing of the Democrats has always had a positive alternative platform of their own. That platform includes the Green New Deal, slavery reparations, transgender athletes, the censorship of social media to ban disinformation as deemed by Fauci, the WHO, as well as anything else that is decided to be disinformation. However, what unites both wings policy-wise of the party has always been an embrace of the strong social safety nets and more government interventions in the economy than the Republicans, such as stricter regulations, higher minimum wages, and stronger social safety nets, particularly now universal health care. Whether or not these issues are winners depends on the mood and the election cycle, and the trade-off between the benefits of such welfare policies compared to the cost of higher taxes and lower economic growth has traditionally been one of, if not the, main division between the two political parties. However, when they aren't winning issues, they aren't losing because people start hating free healthcare or want lower wages. They start losing at the ballot box because people aren't willing to pay the price for these programs anymore. Part of this comes from the immutable economic laws. Most critiques of socialism begin and end with how it disincentivizes labor and innovation, and certainly that can be a part of it. There's also the principled argument made by conservatives that those who work hard and contribute to society shouldn't be penalized with higher taxes to accommodate those who, for whatever reason, don't. Fine. Those are legitimate arguments, but they're also old as time, so I'm not going to go too deeply into either. Instead, another issue that dampens socialist fervor is that sometimes the people, by which I mean the majority of voters, which basically represents the popular will, are more than willing to bear both the blow to economic growth and are more than willing to pay their fair share of taxes in order to provide these social safety nets. They just feel like they aren't getting a good deal. In other words, they reject socialism not because of any ideological or moral objections, but because they simply aren't seeing enough bang for their buck and would rather keep the tax money themselves or give the tax money to a charity that addresses the same social need but more efficiently than the government can. If the Democratic Socialists want to garner nationwide support, this is the real hurdle they need to jump. Most Americans seem to agree with Ronald Reagan that the most frightening words are, "I'm from the government and I'm here to help." as I believe is evidenced by the overwhelming unpopularity of any and all federal health care bills. Obama's ACA was so unpopular that it spurred on the Tea Party movement and led to a red wave only 2 years after Obama was elected with supermajority. And yet, when Trump tried to repeal the ACA, the Republican bill was even more unpopular. My takeaway is that people just don't want anyone on either side in the government messing with their health care. The American people don't really want the government's help. This is more than just Americans' innate independent streak. They don't trust the government to help. They've seen enough FEMA disasters and California wildfire rebuilds, or lack of rebuilds, to have become skeptical that the government can do anything but make matters worse. This is where Mamdani's Commission on Government Efficiency comes in. Going back to his inaugural speech and campaign, Mamdani seems to instinctively understand, in a way that others miss, the biggest problem the Marxist left faces in their attempts to remake America is the public skepticism about their ability to do so. Most of their politicians are so busy making promises about all the good they will do, from the Green New Deal to student debt forgiveness to slavery reparations and DEI, that they start running before they've learned to walk. Politically, they come across as a bit naive to many voters, people who have wonderful ideas and great intentions, but aren't quite sure how to achieve them. It is for this reason that Mamdani's mayoral election has gotten such fervent media attention. That and most journalists are based in New York, and both journalists and New Yorkers are nothing if not self-obsessed. It's one thing for critics to pan the squad's Marxist goals when all previous social experiments at any sort of scale, predominantly communism, have failed miserably. It's another thing entirely to make those criticisms when you have a working beta model of how these policies can be implemented effectively. This is what Gavin Newsom has been trying to do in California, creating a model of a progressive paradise that he and other progressives hope would be adapted nationwide with his 2028 election. Should that fail, Mamdani provides a second opportunity to prove their ideas can be effectively implemented in practice. If the problem is theoretical, that is, socialism doesn't work for the poor economic incentives it provides, the argument we've all heard time and time again, then Mamdani's experiment in New York will inevitably fail. However, if the problem with past socialist experiments is that they've been poorly managed, that's a fixable error. You just have to make government work efficiently for socialism to work. It's the latter that the Marxist left is banking on in New York City. Let's be clear. The government generally sucks ass. Anybody who's ever been to the DMV or had to clear up any other bureaucratic snafu knows this firsthand. On the other hand, who here has ever had to deal with a medical insurance company or Comcast customer service? Those organizations aren't always a model of efficiency themselves, though to be fair, cable companies have an incentive to frustrate customers into keeping their service. The point is that governments aren't the only organizations that are inefficient. They just seem to be uniquely inefficient. This isn't really surprising at all. Governments are unique organizations. There aren't really any other organizations on the planet that can literally torture and kill with impunity. Since Westphalia, the rightful sovereign or government of the land has possessed a monopoly on violence within its borders. The conversation quickly changes when you're the only one in the room with the gun, is my point. Because government holds the ultimate trump card, many of the incentives that force other organizations to become efficient or die are absent from the government. The first one's obvious. If you don't like your government, you can't take your business elsewhere. I mean, technically you could emigrate, but pretty much you only have the one option in your area. It's the ultimate monopoly. Not only is there no competition, they can literally force 100% market saturation because people don't even have the option to forego their product. Everybody in the nation is forced to be their customers in a sense. Second off, because the government has the shotgun, the individual people making the decisions oftentimes can't be held accountable for their corruption, that is, pursuing their own personal interests instead of the stated interests of the government. This is most clearly seen with police corruption, but it's a big problem in all areas of government. If a criminal robs you, you can call the cops, but if it's the cops robbing you, who can you call? The point is that the government can stay profitable and powerful, whether or not it operates efficiently in a way that other organizations cannot, as evidenced by traditional monarchies, kleptocracies, and so forth. However, does this fact mean that the government is inherently more inefficient than other organizations? Or could the government be made to work efficiently and effectively to meet the needs of the people if put into the hands of competent managers operating in good faith to pursue the common good? After all, a government of the people, for the people, and by the people should have only one goal in mind: to serve the people. Well, theoretically. In reality, government's only purpose seems to be to perpetuate itself and keep itself in power, serving its own organizational interests, a term we'll define in more detail in just a moment. However, all organizations are formed to serve some key purpose or have some stated intent. This intent can be narrow or broad, but it's there, with the possible exception of fraternal organizations, which can be primarily social. For example, a breast cancer charity is formed to cure breast cancer. The relative efficiency of such organizations can relatively easily be judged by how much of their resources are devoted to serving this stated purpose. For the government, the purpose is broad: to protect and serve the people. What exactly this means is determined by the elections we hold, but theoretically, all the resources of the government should, in some ways, go towards this end. For reasons we'll examine, this isn't always the case. Here's the main point. Organizations develop their own interests. Departments within the organization develop their own interests, and individuals within those departments develop their own interests. There's a reason Thomas Hobbes chose to call his magnum opus Leviathan. The idea is that a government, once formed, becomes a beast unto itself. That is to say, as we alluded to earlier, the government itself has its own interests to pursue. That is, the government begins to devote resources not to serving its citizens, but to pursuing its own power and influence in society. This is especially true of traditional governments like monarchy, where the state was synonymous with its leaders. Thus, the interests of the leaders are the interests of the state. Putin's Russia would probably be the best concurrent example of this. It's also true of literally every other organization on the planet. Sometimes, as with corporations, these interests are explicit. Nobody disputes that a corporation should pursue its own growth, power, and influence. Doing so is what drives capitalism to work and produce the massive amounts of wealth capitalism creates. There's nothing inherently wrong with this when dealing with private organizations. With governments, it's a little different. We don't expect the government to do what's good for the government. We expect it to do what's best for the people and society at large, even if it means the government giving up control or power. Democracy is intended to yield this effect, as any members of the government pursuing their own interests can safely be voted out. However, democracy stops working when elected officials stop holding the power, as is the case in many bureaucratic states. Hopefully, we all understand that people tend to like power and influence. They also like being parts of powerful entities, including the government. Left to their own devices, that is, without being directly accountable to the voters, this tends to result in government of the government, for the government, and by the government. I would argue that this largely reflects the view of many in the EU and the Democratic Party who seem to view the government as the center of society and the people as existing primarily to serve that government. However, theoretically, this is where government could become more efficient in meeting the needs of society than other organizations. Since there is no inherent organizational interest for the government to pursue, the government should be able to focus all their resources on serving the people. Unfortunately, large social welfare programs also have to be administered, creating exactly the kinds of faceless bureaucracy where abuse and inefficiencies flourish. Each office created to serve the program's intended purpose comes with its own set of interests. That is the incentive for the officer to expand the power and influence of their office or role within the government. For example, if you want to add a generic program, you appoint a head of generic programming for your government. Sure, their incentive is to distribute whatever benefits you're looking to distribute, since that's their stated purpose, and the government spending X amount of money on this purpose does no good if it doesn't get from the government to the hands of its intended beneficiaries. However, this person, like most people, wants power and influence. In administering the program, they aren't only interested in helping the beneficiaries. They want their new department of generic programming to be the biggest, the best department of the government. They want bigger budgets, more hires, flashier technology, and anything else that lets everyone know they are the big cheese of bureaucrats. The impact of this is exponential, as every person they add to their fiefdom has the same incentive. They want to expand their new sub-department of generic programming as much as possible. Additionally, people like nice stuff. The people staffing these offices, these aren't just offices on an organizational flowchart, you understand. These are flesh and blood, real-life, squishy meat creatures staffing these offices. They like to eat good food, enjoy higher wages, and they have their own personal agendas to pursue in these offices, whether they're ideological, religious, or whether they simply have a bug up their butt about some pet issue or whatever. The point is that people are messy, and you can't just assume that they're going to do their jobs and go home. Worse, when making these types of spending decisions, whether to give raises, book cheap or luxury accommodations, attend that conference in Maui in person or via Zoom, and so on, they are spending other people's money on themselves. They have no incentive to conserve and every incentive to splurge. Going back to the DMV, and boy, I've been beating up on them, but now they have a whole show about how the DMV sucks, so they're kind of bringing it on themselves. Possibly the biggest issue is laziness. And this isn't necessarily a character flaw. In government workers, laziness is very much a perk of the job. People tend to think of laziness as a character flaw, but it's actually more of a catalyst to innovation. Smart people getting out of work is responsible for most technological innovation. For example, Johann Gutenberg invented the printing press, the most consequential invention of all time, in my opinion, because he didn't want to hand copy all those damn books like Bart Simpson. Aside from maximizing output with minimal effort, or optimizing output per unit of effort for you math nerds, we all know that we can only deal with so much in any given day. That DMV employee isn't really that lazy. They're just strategically and intelligently conserving their energy for what's really important to them. Given that they work at the DMV, it's usually not their job. And, of course, these interests play into and impact each other in a sort of chaos theory of inefficiency. One of the main reasons there often seems to be no accountability in government is because there's often no accountability in government. The power of public unions aside, holding anyone accountable would create more work for those above them, potentially shrink their superiors' own bureaucratic fiefdoms, and would make others look bad to others in the organization since the malfeasance happened under their watch. Without staffing cuts, over time, bureaucratic creep sets in as the bureaucracy grows to meet short-term needs, but is never trimmed by the periodic staffing cutbacks and layoffs that occur in private industries. This is actually part of the issue that DOGE was set up to address, and is part of the reason the Trump administration has sought such dramatic staffing cuts across the federal government. Now, obviously not every bureaucrat is this way. Many, if not most, are actually very dedicated to their jobs. However, the layers of bureaucracy often insulate decision makers from the facts on the ground, causing them to potentially miss key nuances. Furthermore, each individual has a chance of being corrupt, for lack of a better term, and to simplify the issue considerably. Therefore, each additional actor you include increases the odds of a corrupt outcome. Thank you for joining us on the Rational Nationalist. I've been your host, Lee Ellis, signing off until next time.